Okay, so we'll start now. We have the pleasure of welcoming here Dr. Bruno Scholl, who is making a surprise appearance. We're very pleased to have him here. Bruno Scholl is the head of the Political Press and Information section of the EU delegation to Australia in Canberra. And before joining the EU delegation in Canberra, he was based in the European External Action Service headquarters in Brussels. And there he coordinated with the 28 member state foreign ministries the preparatory work ahead of the monthly meetings of the EU foreign ministers in the Foreign Affairs Council. And prior to that, he worked in the EU Council Secretariat, coordinating the work of the Political and Security Committee. Now, he's also worked in the German Foreign Office, and on the academic side, he has also a prestigious background. So he's been a guest lecturer at the University College London and the University of Mannheim and Cologne. And he holds a PhD in social science from the University of Cologne, an MA in European Studies from the College of Europe, it's a kind of passage obligé in grade, in Bruges, and an MA in political science from the University of Bonn. He has also published on the constitutionalization of the European Union and institutional reform in the EU and the member states. So we know that this is an open lecture. I thought it would be the perfect person to talk about the European External Action Service today, because you have a practitioner, but also with credentials in the academic field. So I think this is really perfect. So I'm very, very pleased to have him speak to you today. And Bruno is going to speak about the European External Action Service, pursuing the EU's international priorities. So welcome, Bruno.
Many thanks, Pascaline. Humbled by the presentation, and I hope you're not expecting too much. Can I ask how far you are in your studies, kind of how much knowledge you have about the institutions and the EU as such? It's just so I don't kind of talk about the fundamentals if you know them already, and I don't kind of jump into transcendental institutional theories if you don't follow them.
So some of them have had about maybe 12 hours of introduction, and some are in their second semester, but most are in their first semester.
Okay.
So it's the beginning. They're learning fast.
If 12 hours of the EU and we're still here, it's a good start. I think I can guess where we're coming from. Yes, I'm very pleased to be here talking a little bit about this newest beast in the European Union, the European External Action Service, which is, to break it down right from the beginning, is a bit like a foreign ministry. At the same time, it's a bit more like a foreign ministry, because we're not only dealing with foreign policy, we're also doing defense, we're also doing security crisis management and development. But I get to that a little bit later. I plan to maybe talk for a bit less than half an hour, and then have, of course, be available for any questions you might have on policy or institutions, and hope that I'll be able to answer. What I tried to run through a little bit is the origins of the EU's external action. As an international institution, it's not evident that you're active in peace and security. There are only a few of them around, and so I explained a little bit where this comes from. The Lisbon Treaty, you might have heard in your first hours of studying the European Union, was as European Union we live on treaties. We are kind of arranging every couple of years our fundamentals afresh, and the last version of this is the so-called Lisbon Treaty, which was brought about with the aim of bringing greater coherence, effectiveness, and efficiency to the work of the European Union, in particular in the area of foreign policy. Then I give you a few more details on this European External Action Service. How big is it? What is it? And what does it entail? And then a few thoughts on the priorities. You understand that within half an hour I will not go too much into detail. I dropped some hints, and I'm happy to then delve into more detail if you want to know about Iran or the Middle East or Ukraine, which is very now I'm very happy to discuss the more kind of substance question of foreign policy. And move on to our strategic partnerships, and in the end give you a little perspective on the EU-Australian relations and the potential how this could develop further. Now, looking at the origins of external action in the European Union, you should keep in mind that this institutional arrangement evolved as a primarily economic enterprise. After the First World War, the idea was to pool sovereignty in fields which were critical to member states' ability to wage war against each other, but the idea was to stay on an economic field. In the beginning, coal and steel, but then it moved on to the economic community. And external action in the first decades of the European Union was confined to projecting economic activities and economic policies to the outside. Trade is probably the most prominent of those, but development aid also came quickly after, and a rather strong, unpoliticized, as they are proud to underline, humanitarian aid arm of the European Union. Foreign policy, in its infancy in the European Union, started in the 70s, where it's actually not much worth talking about, because all it was at the time was a little bit comparing notes, and then realizing that disagreement was still happening on many fields. More seriously, it came about in the 90s with the Maastricht Treaty at the time, but even more so than later on with the Amsterdam Treaty. And once we had the creation of the Office of the High Representative in its earlier form for foreign and security policy, we kind of had this set up for a good 20 years where we had a bit of a mishmash of three executives, so to say, doing foreign policy. The Commission, the Council Secretariat, the place I worked before, where the member states meet, and we had the rotating presidency. What does it mean, the rotating presidency? Every 6 months we changed the face of foreign policy, and the foreign minister of the government that held the presidency was the external representation of the EU. So what the Treaty of Lisbon brought about, realizing that one, it's not very good for foreign policy if you change your front man woman every 6 months. It doesn't allow you to build relationships, it doesn't allow you to kind of build trust over a longer period of time. It just unnecessarily lightens your weight in international relations. And the second realization was that three are just a few too many faces for the European Union to be represented at the outside world. Don't expect you to know these people. It's a mere illustration that with her, you might know her or have heard of her, Catherine Ashton, who is now my boss, our High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. After the Treaty of Lisbon, she took on the task of what three people did before. One, the President of the Foreign Affairs Council. These are our foreign ministers, we meet every month. Two, the Vice President of the Commission. That's the communitarized arm of the executive in the European Union. And three, the coordination of security and defense. So this in one job is quite a hell of a job. And the idea behind it was to give more coherence and strength to the representation of the European Union. And you might have heard of the famous quote from Kissinger in the 70s, whom am I to call when I want to call Europe? I think this was kind of a hint to our American friends whom they might want to call these days when they want to talk about foreign policy. It would be Catherine Ashton. And one result has actually been that the relationship with successive secretaries in the US has been rather good, with Hillary Clinton as well as with Secretary Kerry. So maybe a last illustration, as I myself said in the two versions of the meetings of the G8. Before Lisbon, there was a European crowd of exactly these three people then sitting there representing the European Union. After the Lisbon Treaty, it was only her. Mixed with 8 people, or 11, or 8 people makes quite a difference. If you just show one face, and I think that is quite an, has been quite an. Now, to make this rather impossible job halfway possible, the High Representative was given the European External Action Service as her institutional help. And so for the first couple of years, one of her priorities was to build up this service. It's quite an awkward situation. You could imagine a foreign minister coming into office, not having a foreign ministry. So it's not that the tables are empty, but it's just not clear who his ministry is organized for her ministry. So that's what Catherine Ashton found when she started her job. So in the first couple of months and also years, the setup of this institution was a big task. The second foreign policy priority beyond institutional victories was the focus on the neighborhood of the European Union. And this is something which is rather natural. It's something you do here too. All the talk about Australia and Asia relations, the focus on this is in foreign policy only natural that you start with your neighbor. You sort out your neighborhood and then you start thinking about the great wide world. And in the European Union, it's just the same. The neighborhood to the south, which has been witnessing turbulent years, the last kind of 3-4 years since the Arab awakening. The east, which is in big turmoil now, and I'm happy to talk a little more about this in a minute. And the Balkans, where we've seen the bloodiest wars in the last decades on European soil, but where we've come to a stage where we actually managed for parts of it to be actually already part of the European Union. The other parts are on their way to the European Union. And one thing is absolutely clear: war is out of question these days. Even if in Bosnia they're still fighting a bit amongst each other, but politically not fighting. So let me then quickly move through some of the fundamental data of the European External Action Service. At the core of it was the challenge to bring together 3 different groups of people. One from the Commission, representing economic interests of the European Union in the world. One from the Council Secretariat, who were just looking after peace and security and crisis management. And the third element, member state diplomats. So the idea of this European External Action Service was to create something entirely new. You don't have a role model for this anywhere in the world, or a kind of a supranational institution where national diplomats move in and out for some time. For me, I started in the German Foreign Ministry, but I'm now a European official, a permanent one. I came from the Council Secretariat. My boss at the EU delegation, he is Italian. He's an Italian diplomat. He's there for some time. And my colleague who's running the economic section, also an Italian, but he is a commissioner, or he used to be a commissioner official, and we're joining forces now in this new service. So it sounds very nice in principle, and it's all good in terms of the goal, but to merge groups from 3 different institutional sources is hard work. You might have seen in the private sector, mergers happen all the time. Some fail, some succeed. It's not a given. Here we had not much choice but to succeed, but it was quite a big a big challenge. And the size of the challenge you see when you look quickly on the numbers. This is to say we are not one of the biggest services in the world, far behind the Americans, or not even think of the Chinese in their numbers. But still, 3,400 diplomats, 3,400 staff, 900 diplomats, coming from 28 countries. Is quite a creative mix, but sometimes also kind of difficult to work. We have 140 delegations. That's a decent size. That's quite well represented. And the budget of 500 million per annum, that's now not, or compared to other services, probably not too much. In addition, we get to this in a second, some crisis management operations, and we have some special representatives. Don't be scared. This is an organizational or organigram of the External Action Service. If you look at DFAT's, the Australian Foreign Ministry's organigram, it looks pretty similar. And all I want to illustrate is quite similar in the construction. You have regional departments. I don't have a pointer here right now. Anyway, you will see down here you have regional departments covering Africa, Asia, the Pacific, Northern Africa. You have a corporate section which you have in every service. What is new and what makes it different to any national service that I know of is that part up there which we call our crisis management structures. So we do have in one institution, we bring together diplomats, who are of course all civilians, militaries, and civilian crisis management experts. A bit of a clumsy name because they encompass different kinds of people, policemen, law enforcement experts, judges. So they come from very different backgrounds. And we also have people dealing with the money, spending money internationally, a whole section of them. So this is, I think, the biggest novelty of this service, that we look after diplomacy, development, as well as crisis management, and this goes from civilian crisis management, border monitoring, would be an example, to hardcore military crisis management. Military missions, for example, we deploy in Chad. We have quite a few militaries still in Bosnia, and we had others in Congo. So this I would think is the biggest novelty, to bring this together. And the way we label how we want to use this new setup of bringing together diplomats, development experts, and crisis management experts is the so-called comprehensive approach. The European Union will love terms, well, any institution loves terms. But for us, it's the comprehensive approach which actually signifies this coming together of different policy tools, diplomatic, development, military, civilian, under a political framework that is defined by our ministers. And as an example, I want to give you our engagement at the Horn of Africa, not least because it's also of some relevance to Australia. If you think of the trade routes running from Asia, around India, past the Horn of Africa to Europe, this is a very sensitive area, or maritime area, where both the EU and Australia have very distinct interests in the free passage of trade. And unfortunately, this has been one of the most troublesome regions in Africa after the collapse of Somalia, basically in the mid-90s. We basically experienced a large chunk of land which was lawless, and for a long time. So it took a long while to bring some more order to this, and with some great financial, political, as well as human investment, the European Union, I think, has contributed quite substantially to a development which is not perfect. You don't go to Puntland or Somaliland these days and it's like Switzerland, but to a situation where we have a kind of rule of law in place, which is to be improved, but is substantially better than 10 years ago. How did we achieve that? We do have a strategic framework for the Horn of Africa where all Europeans agreed on the goals that we wanted to achieve. We have intensive high-level political engagement from our High Representative, USR, special representatives, high-level conferences. We bring together, as European Union, as the biggest donor in the world, huge sums of development money, which don't bring much progress if they're not linked to a political strategy. You can build bridges to nowhere if you just want to spend the money. But I think in the whole of Africa, we've managed to bring these tools together under a strategic framework. And we do have crisis management operations in place, a couple of them. Some training the military the security forces of Somalia. Some patrol the waters off the coast of Somalia. That's our military mission, Atalanta, it's called. Simply, it's there to protect the waters off the coast of Somalia. And to illustrate how successful this can be, in collaboration, I'm not saying it's just the European Union doing it, in collaboration with the Americans who are in the region, with the Indians who are in the region, with the Chinese who are in the region. In collaboration, we managed to bring down the number of successful pirate attacks from 170, 80 3 years ago, to about 6 last year. It's a huge difference. And also one of the core business of this mission is to protect the World Food Program ships arriving to Somalia. So we're combining a security aspect with a humanitarian. So I think this is to illustrate this style of policy making that we want to pursue from the European Union, that we call comprehensive approach, and we have followed it in different parts of the world, in Georgia, for example, on the Balkans, but I just wanted to illustrate it with the Horn of Africa. This is a snapshot of our missions in the world. You can see that most are focused on the African continent and our immediate neighborhood. In Asia, so at this stage we only have, we're only present in Afghanistan, but we used to have a mission in Indonesia. Now, looking at the other policy priorities that we have, I mentioned that we focus on our neighborhood, and in recent years this has been clear that the focus was on the southern neighborhood, where we saw the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring, as some called it, that turned into autumn, and the uprisings of societies south of the Mediterranean, which is still continuing, and the terrible situation in Syria continuing, which focused most of our attention, where we deployed, where we tried to help and tried to support the establishment of civilian government supporting the rule of law, sometimes with more, sometimes with less success, but it's still ongoing. We're still largely heavily committed. In the East, we followed a policy of we call the Eastern Partnership. It's a term again that we invented, basically saying we want to approximate the corridor of countries between the European Union and Russia as much as possible to the European Union, without saying whether they should become members at one stage or not. A very difficult, politicized discussion of who should become a member of the European Union in its eastern neighborhood or not. Now, all this careful diplomatic walking around on establishing the Eastern Partnership was basically thrown out of the window in November when at the time President of Ukraine decided not to sign what we call the association agreement with the European Union, which was a huge piece of treaty comprising a political part on rule of law and reform of the law enforcement systems and the like, but also a very substantial trade part. We call this these days deep and free comprehensive comprehensive trade agreement, meaning it's more than just lowering tariffs, it's also the approximation of standards and norms and rules how to do trade. Now, he decided not to sign this, even if the text is very negotiated, or that thick. And what happened afterwards was an uprising in the streets for various reasons, not only pro-European, there were also other forces who were just sick of the current rule, of the way the country was governed, and now this led to a situation with back and forth, and don't go into all the details, where now Russia decided to move in heavily in an unprecedented way after after what we might have seen in Prague, and occupied Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, and has organized a referendum in this part of Ukraine, which has a substantial Russian minority that has voted to become part of Russia. So we're in a situation these days which we haven't seen in Europe for a very long time. Borders are changed by force, actually, in the end, because the Russians moved in a very clandestine way, and we will have to find ways to deal with it. We're coordinating very closely with the Americans, also with the Australians who are helpful in this, respect how to respond to the Russians in these situations. We have kind of started, of course, as we always do, with some statements and kind of putting out our lines and our understanding that this is illegal. It's contrary to international law, contrary to bilateral treaties between the two, Ukraine and Russia. We have started to sanction them. We identified a couple of individuals whose assets are frozen in Europe now and who are not allowed to travel. The same did the Americans with some different people. But at this stage, we are not in a situation yet where we actually know where we will be going with this conflict. It's right in our neighborhood, very nasty conflict. Not bloody at this stage, but still military heavily involved. And the next stage would possibly be, or probably be, and that's what we are thinking about now, is to put economic sanctions in place to show Russia that they have crossed the line, which is non-negotiable for us. Economic sanctions, if you see the interdependence between Russia and Europe economically, will of course hurt both sides. But it will be important to identify measures that we as Europeans can bear, or we can bear the pain, we can inflict some pain on the Russians. That's basically the purpose of the sanction. So there is not, I've leave it there, and I'm happy to respond to questions, but this is actually a big worry these days for European foreign policy, bigger than we have seen it in a long time. Now in the Balkans, there we have some better news. Serbia has, you must kind of keep in mind the situation starting from the 90s, where we had the bloodiest war in ex-Yugoslavia between the old Yugoslav republics, and Yugoslavia breaking up, some of the republics moving closer to the European Union. Slovenia joined, Croatia now also joined, but still 10 years ago, or now it's 11, 12 years ago, we had a very nasty war in Kosovo, where Serbia inflicted horrific human rights violations on the Kosovo population, and the other way around, just a smaller proportion. And 10 years after, we are in a situation where this, and I want to stress it as well, because the situation of Kosovo was so different to what we experience now in Crimea, where now we're 10 years after the Kosovo-Serbia conflict, where the two parties talk to each other, find ways to organize their life peacefully. Serbia is accepted applicant to the European Union. Kosovo is not quite there yet. Its statehood is also still a bit contested. But where we find ways of dealing like civilized people with each other, and the road towards the European Union is clear for both of them. So I think the Balkans is a case where the European Union has shown rather strong leadership in bringing about peace. Less on peace and war, maybe, and more on diplomacy, is our relation to our strategic partners. The little title in that is, you say, 10 strategic partners. 4 of them are located actually in Asia. And this also tells you a little bit about, while on the one hand, the neighborhood is our priority, dealing with key partners all over the world is at the same time a priority too. And with Russia, we have now big troubles, and we will see whether we can uphold the strategic partnership. But the US, China, South Korea, Japan are all very close partners with whom we work across the board. And the defining element for a strategic partnership is more my defining element. It's not something we will put out in documents. But what defines a strategic partnership is that you go beyond bilateral relations. You're not just sorting out your trade in cars and services. You're not just sorting out your exchanges of researchers and how you can improve this or what warship you can sell to each other. But you start thinking of how to address global problems together, regional or global problems together. And I'll give you a couple of examples how this can work. In the case of Iran, where the European Union leads the international efforts to contain the Iranian nuclear program, we're working extremely closely together with our key strategic partners, the US, China, also Russia. Russia has been very constructive in these talks, given their very close relations to Iran. But until the turn of events in the Ukraine, we had seen a very constructive Russia in these so-called E3+3 talks. Another example, and I'm happy to go more into detail. Another example, or maybe to continue, on Iran, where we follow the so-called dual-track approach of diplomacy, the negotiations led by Catherine Ashton, and sanctions. And I think the sanctions part is one part of the story where we have been working extremely close with our strategic partners who are not even in the negotiating room. Rather painful, the sanctions focus on the petrochemical sector, but is also on issues that you call dual use. You can use a pipe to build a pipeline, but also a centrifuge for uranium. So these kind of are quite far-reaching sanctions. Anything that could remotely be related to building up your nuclear program is banned. It is not only done by the US and by the Europeans, it's also done by the Japanese, by the South Koreans, and by the Australians, by the way. We've been coordinating very close to response because it doesn't make any sense if the European Union freezes the import of Iranian oil if the Chinese are then going and buying it at a cheaper price because the Iranians need to get rid of it. So it needs a very strong international coordination, cooperation effort to make sure this doesn't happen. And in the case of Iran, it has been quite successful, and the progress in the negotiations in recent months is actually quite striking. The other example I just want to mention in passing is the Middle East peace process. Usually not something you should mention in passing, but where the EU is part of the official negotiation format, the so-called Middle East Quartet. Alongside the US, again, Russia, again, key strategic partners, and the UN. Now, where at the moment the US has taken the leads, with Secretary Kerry devoting an awful lot of his time towards finding a solution and bringing Mr. Netanyahu and Abbas to the negotiating table. And we will see whether this succeeds, I think, within a couple of weeks. I will only lightly touch now on the Asia Pacific. I mentioned the strategic partners that we have in the Asia Pacific: Japan, South Korea, China and India. But beyond the relations to those, the European Union is heavily engaged in building up ASEAN as a viable structure, as kind of a partner or brother organization, but much younger brother than we are there. Compared to the European Union, the level of integration in ASEAN is far less dense. We're working very closely with them, not only because we like regional integration organizations, but because we see that the problems they have to deal with at their doorstep, South China Sea, the East China Sea, what we call the Asian security architecture, is quite shaky, actually. And before, we now looked all the time to Ukraine, but many looked at Japan and China and how these two are behaving to each other on the Senkaku Island. And so the European Union has an intrinsic interest to keep this part of the world peaceful and calm too. So we're investing heavily both in terms of money and in personnel. Of course, we don't stop being a big trading bloc, the biggest single market in the world. So we are pursuing at the same time our commercial interests. There's nothing to hide about it. We've concluded agreements with South Korea. We are negotiating with Japan. We have concluded with Singapore. And so following our intensive, our big trade interests here. Now, moving lastly, a bit more than half an hour, to the relations with Australia. You noticed I didn't mention Australia when I talked about the strategic partners for the European Union. It doesn't have that formal status, but according to my definition of strategic partner, it actually comes very close. Because what we do with Australia is actually work together to address common problems. In this, for example, at the Horn of Africa or in Europe, when it comes to Iran, issues like this. Now, looking at the formal relationship, as I said before, we love treaties at the European Union. That's what we do. And we're negotiating for a while now what we call the Framework Partnership Agreement with Australia, which is not more and not less than bringing on a legal basis the broad range of cooperation that we have. I think the fundamentals of the relationships are very strong. Trade is, well, sometimes it's not realized, but we are the third largest trading partner in merchandise with Australia. We're the biggest trading partner in services. It's not China. We're the biggest investor in Australia when it comes to direct foreign investment. These are the kind of fundamentals that sometimes are forgotten. The areas of cooperations go far and wide. Cooperation in science, in research, in development, in industrial relations. So all these different bits of pieces are supposed to be brought together under one framework agreement. And as these things take time, we're not there yet, but we are on a good way, and hope to conclude this rather soon. Where we are already a step further is in the area of crisis management. Also referring back to my point on we're actually working together to address common problems. We have negotiated what we call a framework agreement on crisis management. All it means is this allows the Australians to participate in European crisis management missions. The ones do that. Sorry, it's only my screen that went dark. So our crisis management missions, and it's actually a point we're trying to make, and I think that the Australians bought and realized is a rather cost-effective way. If you want to get engaged internationally, you don't have to mount your own mission, you just participate in someone else's. And with Australia being at the Security Council these days, the interest in the foreign policy orientation is somewhat wider than it used to be. And we're now in the last phases, actually, of arranging the first ever contribution of Australia to an EU crisis management operation off the whole of Somalia, where Australia will actually participate in our efforts, which is a very good development. Further down, another field where we have started cooperating in a similar vein. I think these days where budgets for foreign policy are shrinking. We need to find clever ways of working together. So we did that also in the field of development policy. And I can assure you it's not easy, because when it comes to spending taxpayers' money, we are quite peculiar. After we had some scandals kind of 20 years ago, the rules on how we spend taxpayers' money are quite stringent. But the same applies also to Australia. When it comes to development aid, we're talking about public money. And there we actually found ways that allow Australian agencies now to spend European development money where the Australians are more present, and the European Union to spend Australian development aid money where the European Union is more present. Examples are South Sudan, where we are quite present. It's basically adjacent to the home that is a bit further away. Where the EU is quite engaged in finding a resolution and helping South Sudan to come on its feet. Where the Australians provide some funds into European projects on agriculture and animal health. It's like development aid is already. And on the other hand, the European Union provides funds to Australian projects in Fiji, vocational projects that helps finding communities which are heavily reliant only on the sugar industry to diversify their skill sets. Anyway, the point I'm making is we're in a relationship so close that we trust each other to spend each other's money, and that's quite a good step. Now, on political cooperation, of course, the Security Council has increased the cooperation. We're doing it in Asia, in the South China Sea, or where we compare notes. We have now been intensely in touch with the Australians on how to respond to Ukraine. And you might have seen the statement by the Foreign Minister last week coming out, where you yourself, or the Australian government, has enacted some travel bans which are similar to ours. Right? In Europe, according to your legal system, it's not allowed to publish them, but I can assure you they're not much different to the list that we have published. So maybe to end on that note, I think the EU-Australian relationship, partnership is on a quite good track. We're moving from a situation of like-minded partners into an operational cooperation phase. We work on crisis management, we work on development policy, we work on sanctions together. And then not to forget the G20, which is hosted by Australia this year, where the EU luckily has become, or moved from being a subject of discussion to being a contributor to solutions after we kind of left the worst phase of the financial crisis behind us. So I think the rest of the year will see a steady stream of visitors from Europe coming to Australia, and I'm rather confident that we go in the same direction of intensifying the relations. Thanks. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions.